of, well, one way that we've kind of gone over for foreshortening so far is by thinking about objects as simple three-dimensional shapes. So rather than say an arm, for instance, being just a graphic shape that appears flat, we can think about that arm as a dimensional shape, right, that has, right, some volume to it as it moves in one direction or another. And thinking about an arm or a leg or a torso or a pelvis, right, effective in foreshortening effectively just deals with thinking about this space, right, and its junction points of shoulder, elbow, wrist, as now basically overlapping each other, so that as an arm comes towards you, you can effectively limit the amount of space that you draw in by overlapping these objects with respect to each other, so that when we start to put in things like a bicep or an extensor, or where the hand is going to start, or your flexors, or your deltoid, or anything like that. All of that stuff effectively gets trapped inside the amount of space that we've provided for it. By overlapping those simple shapes and only providing a certain amount of room, a certain amount of space, right, for those shapes to occupy. Now, this is useful, right, because, you know, it's a relatively, well, I won't say, it's not a simple thing to do, right, but we can do that without, you know, applying, you know, any sort of like analytical aspect to things. It's very much a touchy-feely way of going about it. But, right, because it is kind of like a touchy-feely aspect of approaching the subject, there's also a lot of room for variance, right? And it's going to make more or less sense to people. Right? And, you know, there's not really a way that I can point to it in some sort of like second decimal place accuracy of like, do this all the time and it's always going to work. As opposed to this other way of controlling foreshortening that uses horizontal and vertical plumb lines, because now there is something very specific that I can point to, right? But what this requires, right, is basically using things in the pose that you've drawn already that are relatively easy, that you can then compare back to. So when we're taking comparisons, right, in a pose, we not only need ways to compare, we also need things to compare to. And this is again why the gesture becomes so important, because the gesture provides us something to start with and compare back to. So let's say that we take a simple pose that has one standing leg unforeshortened, one's arm that's also unforeshortened directly at the side. Even the generic proportions of this stuff now give us something to make drawing the pose a little bit easier. And so, for instance, like I can compare this ankle to the rest of the pose to see where the weight of the pose is being held. I can compare the wrist to the base of the groin, the elbow to the base of the rib cage, the hand to the middle of the thigh, as a way of starting to solidify that proportion. Now, let's say irritatingly, though, you've got a foreshortened element of the pose. Say that the leg is raised and the knee is coming towards you, or the hand is coming straight out and irritatingly doing something like this. Your brain knows that there's information between your hand and your shoulder, and it's going to try and make you draw that stuff. Right? So it's basically going to try and make you draw a fully proportional arm inside the space, even though it's not fully proportional because of the foreshortening. Same thing with a leg, same thing with anything else in the body. So a nice way of controlling that sense of foreshortening is by taking one of each of these things from the terminal end of that foreshortened element. So what do I mean by terminal end? If your arm is coming towards you like this, well, foreshortened or otherwise, that arm has to start at the shoulder. So you've got one end already set up by default. The other end is the wrist, right, or the hand. So what I'm trying to do is take a horizontal plumb line from the center of that hand and a vertical plumb line from the center of the hand and see where it crosses over stuff or how those things relate to what I've already drawn. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that my hand is coming forward and at a vertical position is level roughly there with respect to the torso. And let's say also, for the sake of argument, that I take a vertical plumb line from that same hand and find out that laterally, that's where my hand is. Where those two lines cross over gives me the position of that hand. So that when I go in and put in a version of the hand, always got to make sure the thumb's on the right side. Right. That hand now, because it has to be there, means that since the wrist has to be attached to the hand, that's all of the arm that I can see. Right? So that controls that foreshortening, which means that whatever position the arm happens to be in, all of the details of that arm have to now be trapped inside that space. And as a result, limits the amount of stuff that you can draw, right? And forces your brain, right, to basically see what's in front of it as opposed to what it thinks is in front of it. Same thing with the knee. Let's say that the knee, if I take a measurement, a horizontal comparison, tells me that the knee is level kind of with the hand. And then I take a vertical comparison, and let's say that the center of the knee is roughly level with the outside of the shoulder. Where those two lines cross over gives me the position of the knee. So that because the knee has to project out from the hip, the same as it would in any position of the leg, that's all the upper leg that I can see. Let's say that the lower leg is now going back in space. So pretty common view. Let's say that the horizontal line tells me that the vertical position of the ankle is just above the knee. The vertical plumb line tells me that the knee is just, or the ankle is just inside that knee. That means that that lower leg can only be that long. Now, this doesn't help you in terms of, say, what it's like to actually draw that stuff. Right? Drawing a foreshortened leg is no easy piece of business necessarily. But what it does do is it tells you that regardless of what you have to draw now, it all has to be trapped inside that space. Same thing with the calf. All of that calf stuff now has to be trapped inside that space. And you can do the same thing with the foot. Say that the top of the heel is there, inside of the foot is there, bottom of the foot is there, furthest most outside section of the foot is there. All that stuff does, right, is helps to lock that stuff in place. So those measurements do, it helps to lock that stuff in space so that now at least, again, you've solved one particular problem, right? Where that thing is, what its overall proportion is, so that now you can concentrate on the problem of physically drawing the thing in terms of its details, as opposed to where that thing is, regardless of its details. Okay, how does that sit with everybody? Any questions?
It sits well with me.
What's that?
I think I understand it, but
Cool. Well, let's do a demonstration and see if that illuminates it further. So Melissa, huh? I'm just about to call for you. So now I'm calling for you. So good timing. Huh, she says. Oh, my right hamstring is a mess. Information that you all needed to know.
At least it's relatable.
Yeah, I'm not the only person with aches and pains, that's for certain. Oh, bye, Melissa. I think Melissa just got kicked out.
I just almost tried to call SOS by accident on my phone.
See the SWAT team break down the door in the background. That'd be worthwhile. That'd be worth the price of admission. Holy shit. Michael O'Dane, owner of the Polygon Gallery and Polygon Development, just donated $100 million to the Vancouver Art Gallery to
I saw
complete
that.
to
It's a lot of
complete the
money.
construction of their much contested new gallery, right, in the downtown core. Wow. The pissing contest just got real amongst the local developers.
Uh-oh.
Are they still gonna call it Chan Center for the Arts then?
Well, the Chan family did donate another 40 million. So they'll probably have a wing for sure.
Yeah, I
How
heard they
people
was
have so
called
much money.
Chan Center.
I like how it's literally just, I want my name on something. Let me just throw money at it until I'm the top.
That's it, man. Buying your way into art history. There's a great Robert Hughes documentary on the art world, where he interviews a large patron of the arts in London, who's one of Damien Hirst's early and large benefactors. And that's basically what he accuses him of in the interview, is buying his way into art history. And the guy just looks at him and says, yeah, there's no bones about it. They know what they're doing.
I mean, I think I'm in the same boat. I can't speak for him, but I'm going to guess, because we were actually talking about this the other day with Ed. I don't care who donates money as long as it improves the art viewability in Vancouver, so we don't have to take a trip down to Seattle for anything.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
It would be really nice to see something other than Emily Carr here.
Mhm. Do they want to give me money?
One day, Angelina. One day, Angelina, our ships will come in. Okay, so none of this affects, again, your gesture, other than how you start to integrate this on a more kind of naturalized basis, where this just becomes second nature to you. Okay, so all of that stuff is still the same. Where this does start to affect now is that I can use easier stuff to draw, say like where the base of the pelvis is, right? Because that pelvis is still going to be there's still going to be a relatively basic shape. What that upper arm is doing here, that upper arm is totally unforeshortened, but I can still see that that arm, right, or that elbow is at this vertical position with respect to the rib cage. I can also see, right, that if I take a vertical plumb line straight down from there, that my hip actually isn't that far out. So that helps me to develop that comparison, or that area, a little bit more accurately as well. This arm is entirely unforeshortened, right? But I can still control its position with respect to what I've already drawn by taking a horizontal plumb line to identify where it is in terms of its overall proportion relative to what it is that I've already drawn. Now, what that also does, if I take a horizontal plumb line from here straight across, that also tells me that the bottom of this hand and the bottom of this hand are level with each other. Right? And so is the wrist. If I take a vertical plumb line straight up from the wrist, that tells me that the wrist sits right about there inside the shoulder, right? And also lines up right about with the outside of the head, which means that my wrist, where those two lines cross over, has to be kind of there, which means that this is as much forearm as I'm now allowed to draw, because that's where the elbow has to be. This is where I've just proven where the wrist is. And as a result, the hand coming off of there also has to be in that position. Same thing with the knee, right? The knee is basically directly underneath that hand. So that becomes easy to kind of guesstimate in terms of its position, both vertically and laterally, because I've already got this put in, which means that this knee becomes super easy to draw because it has to be wedged right up against this. Right? And now because these two legs are entirely unforeshortened, I can just draw generic proportion legs. On the bottom of that pose, but I can still use, say, this foot as a way of positioning where the heel of this foot now has to be. And I can use the bottom of this foot as a way of controlling how far out in space this foot projects. Right, so this would be kind of like a major element of controlling foreshortening, but you can also do that with relatively minor elements of it as well. So now again, this doesn't help at all, right, in terms of how you draw those things. Right? That's a totally separate subject. But at least at this point now, you've got an idea of where those things have to be, so that when you do come in and start to draw, say, said knee, all right, well, now I know that the knee has to be there, which means the femur has to be there, which means my lateral quad has to be there, the head of my tibia has to be here, my femur has to, or my fibula has to be there, which means that my ankle has to be here, which means that my shin bone has to be here, which means a little bit of that calf will be able to be seen from there, right? And all of that stuff right, at the very least is going to be in the right spot, right? Because I've taken care of that problem doing this. Same thing for the hand, same thing for anything else in the pose. Thank you, Melissa, that was great. Okay, so when we're developing observational tools for drawing, what we're essentially doing is breaking the pose down to geometry in a way.
Sorry to
Angelina,
interrupt,
you can
but
play your
do you
video
want
feed
me?
for right now. Huh?
Do you need me right at the, should I sign in?
No, you're good. I got about maybe about 5-10 minutes.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay. Semiljanovich, you can kill your video feed for right now. Dankeschön. Hey, we're developing tools to basically prove where things are, right? And right, divorce ourselves emotionally, right? Or predispositionally towards what it is that we're seeing, right? And your brain is quite naturally does this, right, as a way of simplifying things and right, feeding off of things that it's familiar with, and as a result gradually distorts things or naturally distorts things in ways that, you know, aren't necessarily intuitive or directly obvious, right? So when we're developing comparison tools, what we're effectively doing is forcing elements into particular positions relative to each other, so that we're more likely to see those things both quickly and over long periods of time as they actually are, as opposed to the way that we think that they are. So two of the most basic tools that we're dealing with are vertical plumb lines and horizontal plumb lines. Now, I'm pretty sure I haven't gone over this with you yet, have I?
No, I don't think so.
I don't
No.
think so.
I didn't think so. Okay, always good to check. Now, what these things are, very fancy measuring technique is this your pencil, right? Holding your pencil at a vertical or at a horizontal to compare things that are along that horizontal line or along that vertical line. So basically you're comparing point A to point B along a horizontal or a vertical. And we're quite good at doing this in terms of recognizing a vertical versus a horizontal for a number of different reasons. One, because they first off, don't occur in nature, right? So when we see those things, right, they tend to look like they stand out from the natural world that we're much more familiar with than the world that we basically constructed around or inside of that natural world over our brief history on this planet. Right, and as a result of that, we're pretty good, and as a result of that, we're pretty good at recognizing when something is perfectly vertical or horizontal, right? So an easy example of this is if you've ever hung a picture on a wall. Generally speaking, you don't break out the spirit level and right, see the little bubble. You just kind of like tap it back and forth until it's level, right, or as it appears level. So we're pretty good at doing this. Now, what this does, and what we're not so good at, is or allows us to identify whether a point at this end of that line and this end of that line actually line up with each other, right? So, for example, if I take, this isn't going to work very well. If I take a vertical line from, say, this point of my t-shirt, right, and come straight up, right, that's going to allow me to tell, or that's going to tell me that this point and this point have to line up on top of each other. So let's just say, for sake of argument, that it's the end of the V of my t-shirt and the corner of my left eye line up in relationship to each other. That's a really strong measurement, because now those 2 points have to have this relationship to each other. And the exact same thing along a horizontal. Like if I take a horizontal line from the bottom of my t-shirt on this side, right, and compare it, right, to this side, and if this side, or if the bottom of this t-shirt happens to line up with the bottom of this side of the t-shirt, then that's a really strong measurement. So ideally what we're looking for is things that line up directly along this horizontal and vertical. But what those things also tell us is what's over to the left of that line and what's over to the right of that line, or what's above and what's below that line. So this becomes equally useful, because as I take a vertical plumb line up from here, it tells me that this chunk of my face has to be over to the left-hand side of that, and everything else has to be over to the right. Likewise, a horizontal plumb line from here tells me that certain information has to be above, certain information has to be below that horizontal plumb line. So when we're dealing with, say, a standard weight pose that has a weight shift to it, let's say that we take, hand on hip, weight shifted over to one side, other hand doing another thing, whatever. Let's say that that's the pose. Let me just darken this up so that it's a bit more visible. One thing that you can do, right, and you can do this as early as, say, 2 minutes, right, and ultimately the goal is that you're getting good enough, right, at doing this naturally that you start to recognize this at speed, so that it also starts to affect how accurate your 30-second drawings are as well. One really useful vertical plumb line to take inside, say, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, right, and especially above that, is identifying where the weight-bearing section of the pose is. So if my hip is shifted out like this, that means that this is the weight-bearing leg, which means that this is the weight-bearing ankle. If I take a vertical plumb line up from that ankle, and the middle of the ankle happens to line up with the outside of the head, that's a really useful comparison to make, because now those two things have to relate to each other like that. And as a result, the central weight-bearing axis of the pose now gets controlled. So it tells you that this much hip has to be out in that, or in that direction. It also tells you that this much stuff has to be out in that direction, and it might tell you even more granular stuff, right? Say how much hand has to be on one side or the other of that, where the central pelvic plate, right, has to be with respect to that, maybe where, right, the nipple and the breast happens to be. So you can get quite granular with those comparisons, but you can also be quite general, right? So with these general measurements or these general comparisons, what we're doing is essentially giving us something that's a little bit better than a guess, right? So that we can start to gradually refine the pose a little bit more clearly. Now, you can also take other vertical plumb lines. Let's say that we take another one from this knee, if I take one from that knee straight up, right, that tells me that maybe the shoulder lines up directly in line with that knee. So now those two things are attached to each other, right, or compared to each other. Likewise, say I take a vertical plumb line up from that ankle. Maybe that tells me that the hand and the ankle have to line up with each other, but the elbow is wedged someplace in between those things. So this becomes a really useful way of tying things, right, from the top of the pose to the bottom of the pose together, and also forcing information that's in between those points that do happen to line up, right, into certain positions. So these are all really useful measurements because they cut through a big chunk of the body. This isn't a useful measurement, right, because it compares that elbow to nothing. Right? So when we don't have points of comparison above or below, those vertical plumb lines aren't particularly useful. Likewise with a horizontal plumb line. If I take a horizontal plumb line from this elbow and it tells me that this elbow lines up, that's a really good measurement or a really good comparison, because now those two things have that relative or that relationship to each other. But it also tells me that the breast is above that. Maybe it tells me that, right, the belly button is below that. If I took a horizontal plumb line from the hand, that tells me that the belly button is up here and maybe the pelvic plate, right, is down below. Horizontal plumb lines that we've already done, where's the shoulder axis relative to the chin? Horizontal plumb line from the top of the hand here might tell me that it cuts through the head, someplace like that. Useful horizontal plumb lines are from the knees, right, comparing those two things to each other. From the bottom of the foot, say of or from the ankles or from the bottom of the feet, to compare those things relative to each other. So inside, say, a 5-minute pose, you've got maybe like 5 to 10 different comparisons that you can take as a way of solidifying your sketch. Little Jam's going crazy. There's birds outside the window. He's in hunt mode. He's making little squeaky noises, you know. Okay. The key ones that you want to try and make are finding the weight bearing axis for your vertical poses, especially in standing poses, but also comparing the joints to each other along verticals and horizontals, especially in a standing pose along horizontal plumb lines. That would be the exact opposite if we were in a reclining pose, right, where your vertical axes, right, might be just as useful to compare your joints relative to each other.
And in the future, is this something that you kind of always want to have in your drawings, or is it something that you more do mentally, like keep tracking of?
Something more that what?
So adding these lines in, is this something that you want to continuously do like on paper, or is it something that you also want to learn just doing without, like, mentally?
It's a good question, right? So kind of both. Right? So one benefit of physically drawing these things down is that now you have that visual representation of those things, or of that thing, which makes it much easier for you to recognize what it is that you're looking at and what it is that you're trying to control. But by the same token, right, one of the reasons that, say, like, just to use myself as an example, say that my drawings would be more consistently accurate than, say, somebody, right, or somebody that's a little bit newer to this subject. The reason that that's the case, both at the 30-second, 2-minute, 5-minute level, right, is because this type of comparison has been internalized, where you start to recognize this information more and more quickly, more and more naturally, so that when you're doing a drawing inside 30 seconds, that thing becomes more accurate because you know, right, where things have to be, because you start seeing the world in this type of way. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, so along those lines, Melissa, if you could fire up your camera feed, all right, and we'll do a 5-minute pose.
Gotcha.
And I'll show you what I mean in both senses, right? Because ideally what you're doing when you start taking these, like, physically measuring these things like this, holding your pencil up and then drawing those lines down and comparing and stuff, ideally speaking, you don't have to do much adjustment because the sketch is already relatively accurate, because that way of seeing the world has been internalized, right? And hopefully this will work out to emphasize what it is that I'm talking about. Poor little Jam Jam's losing his mind. They're gonna be so sad. So sad. Oh, it's a little bug that he wants. Look how big that cat is. He's an immense little kitten.
He's a long boy.
Captured for the ages.
Very
so
long,
anything
fluffy
at all,
boy.
Melissa, that's comfortable for you for 5 minutes. Okay, so as we go over this in the second half of today's class as well, Camilla, you can kill your, oh, perfect. As we go over this in the second half of class today as well, you'll see that this is also a particularly useful way of controlling foreshortening, but we'll go over that when the time comes. For right now, none of this affects your gesture, right? So your gesture remains just as loose and just as light as always. Right, and the more that you get, or the more that you get better at this, or the better you get at this, rather, as my English gets much gooder, the less that you'll actually have to take any sort of controlling plumb lines in order to make your drawing more accurate, right? Because you'll be able to recognize this stuff naturally when you start doing the structural phase of your drawing. So that rather than having to hold up the pencil and do stuff, right, you'll essentially already have done it just by training your eye to see these things. Or rather, training your brain to see these things, I suppose, is a better way of putting it. Right, and this is just another tool, again, amongst many, of how we make the drawings just a little bit more accurate. Okay, so at this stage, at this structural stage, for instance, if I take a vertical plumb line from the side of the pose, right, and I'm doing this in the pose, right, as opposed to my drawing, right, that tells me that the edge of the hip here has to line up about with the middle of the shoulder, right? So this is what I mean where it starts to get pretty accurate, right, at this point. Right? If I took a horizontal plumb line from the bottom of the glute straight across, right, and again in the pose, right, where the leg starts to change direction at the couch, right, is different than where it starts to change direction into the bottom of the leg, and the top, and this point here, right, is level with the top of the knee of this leg. This point here is level with the bottom of the knee. But by the same token, both of those things, right, tell me that this knee now has to be in this position relative to that knee. And this thing here tells me that there's about that much leg up on top of this. It also tells me that there's only about this much leg here for me to see on this side of things. And when I draw in this generic leg, right, that doesn't really have any sort of foreshortening to speak of, and I can just rely on generic proportions in order to deal with that. If I take a vertical plumb line from that knee or from that ankle, that tells me that that ankle is just in front of that. And you can see it's like I'm not really having to do a whole lot of adjustment, right, to this, because I've already done the adjustment when I started to solidify the structure of my gesture. So the gesture wasn't accurate, but it was accurate enough in order to where other things needed to be. Okay, so for instance now, okay, the breast projects about this much out in front of the torso, but now I can see that the arm enters into the torso right about here, right? But also that the hand, if I took a horizontal plumb line from it, the bottom of it would be right about there in relationship to the torso. And so that helps me to, if not reposition things, solidify the position of those things. Likewise, a horizontal plumb line from the bottom of this hand to the pelvis tells me that the bottom of the hand has to be here, right, in a vertical position. And since the elbow has to be there, and the elbow and the hand have to be attached to each other, that means that my hand has to be there laterally. This is also similar to what we were doing with the head. When we start to grow the head up out of the torso, a vertical plumb line from the front of the head tells me that the front of the head is here. The back of the head is kind of there, right? And that there's about this much space between the top of the shoulders and the base of the chin, which means now that I've got a rough box that my head has to exist inside of, proportionally and positionally. Okay, so now this doesn't do anything, right, at all in terms of helping you draw those things once they're in position. But what it does do is it solves the problem of putting those things in position, so that at least proportionally, positionally, you've solved those problems. And now at least, like if you go in and say, you know, there's still a myriad of ways that we can fuck up an arm or a foot or whatever when we start drawing the details of it. At least now we don't have to worry about where that thing is.
Ready to connect.
That makes sense? Or is that helpful? If anybody answered, I couldn't hear, so. I don't know what's going on with my audio here today. But as long as you guys can hear me and I don't get any outrages in the chat, I'll presume that you guys can hear me and that this makes sense. And now we are ready to apply that to some longer drawings. Okay, so we're going to do 10-minute drawings. It's exactly like positional gridding, Caden, right? Except you're creating the grid as you go along, as opposed to, you know, laying a grid over top of an image and then transferring
Ready to
it,
connect.
and then transferring it to another surface. Okay, so we're going to go into 10-minute sketches. Right? Gesture and basic structure exactly the same way as we have been, right? But now when we get into, once you've got that down, rather than just trying to go into developing details, right, or refining the pose more, just go through it as a, you know, a learning exercise, if nothing else. From every joint, take a vertical and horizontal plumb line and compare it to, right, the farthest reaches of the sketch, right? So as far horizontally as the sketch or as the pose allows you to, as far vertically as the pose allows you to. And remember, you're doing this in the drawing, or sorry, in the pose, right? Over top of the pose, as opposed to over top of your drawing. You're measuring over top of the pose.
Ready
right?
to connect.
But then you're drawing those lines down over top of your drawing, right? To see if those measurements or those comparisons agree with what you got. And if they don't agree with what you got, then it's a matter of trying to figure out how to change what you got to make it more accurate. Okay, that's easier said than done, but let's start off, right? Everybody, let's get your feeds and your shares up.